My own son left me at a nursing home on my birthday, and a week later my life was touched by an incredible lottery win. That moment marked the beginning of something remarkable. What began as an unexpected change soon unfolded into a twist of fate that no one, least of all my son, ever imagined. In the quiet where celebration should have been, destiny placed in my hands something extraordinary. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. I remember that morning with such clarity. The sky outside my window was a pale blue, streaked with the soft golden light of sunrise. I had woken up feeling older than ever, but I also carried a small, stubborn hope that perhaps my son would remember the meaning of the day. Birthdays had always been something we celebrated as a family. My late wife used to bake a simple cake, and my son would place a candle in the middle, grinning as he sang off-key. Those memories were etched into me like warm fingerprints on glass. But this birthday was different. This one carried a shadow I could not shake. My son had arrived early, his voice too cheerful, his smile stretched just a little too tight. He said he was taking me on a drive, a surprise to celebrate my special day. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think that even if the years had made him busy, even if his own family now took up most of his time, he still had a place in his heart for me. I dressed carefully, putting on the blue sweater my wife once said made me look distinguished, and I waited with a flicker of anticipation. The car ride was filled with small talk. He asked me about my health, about whether I had been eating well. I tried to answer with humor, but there was a hollowness in his voice that unsettled me. We passed by streets I did not recognize, neighborhoods unfamiliar to my eyes. I asked him where we were going, and he said, "You'll see, Dad, it's for your birthday." Those words, said so casually, felt like both a promise and a warning, though I did not understand their weight at the time. When we pulled into the driveway of the nursing home, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The building loomed large and sterile, its windows lined with identical curtains. A few residents sat outside on the benches, their faces worn by years, their eyes glazed with the dullness of waiting. My heart sank, but I clung to the hope that maybe this was just a stop. Maybe he wanted me to visit a friend or take a tour, anything but what I feared. He helped me out of the car, his hand firm yet detached. As we walked inside, I noticed he carried a folder tucked under his arm. The receptionist greeted him warmly, as if they had spoken before. Papers were exchanged, pens scratched across documents, and still I stood there, trying to make sense of it all. Finally, he turned to me, his eyes avoiding mine, and he said the words that would shatter me. "It's for the best, Dad. You can't manage alone anymore. You'll be more comfortable here." Comfortable. The word echoed inside me like a cruel joke. It was my birthday, the one day I longed for family, for warmth, for acknowledgement of the life I had lived and the sacrifices I had made. Instead, I was being handed over like an old coat no one wanted to keep. I wanted to protest, to remind him of the nights I stayed awake, to nurse him through fevers, the years I worked 2 jobs to pay for his education, the dreams I had set aside so he could chase his own. But the words froze in my throat. The staff took me to a small room with bare walls and a single bed. They placed my modest suitcase at the foot of it, the same suitcase I had packed without knowing why my son asked me to bring it. I sat on the edge of that bed, my hands trembling, my heart heavy with disbelief. Outside the window, I could see him walking back to the car. He did not look back, not once. That night, as the nursing home settled into silence, I lay awake with tears sliding down my face. The clock ticked steadily, reminding me that my birthday had slipped away unnoticed, uncelebrated. I was just another old man in a room full of strangers, abandoned by the one person I thought would always stand by me. Yet deep inside, beneath the sorrow and the betrayal, something stirred. A whisper of fate, a shift in the air. I did not know it then, but within a week, my life would change forever. The day of betrayal did not arrive like a sudden storm, but rather like a slow and creeping fog that settled around me until I could no longer see clearly. I remember waking with the thought that my birthday would be special because my son had insisted we go out together. He had smiled when he said it, that practiced smile that I once believed held genuine affection, and I let myself be comforted by the possibility that perhaps he still cared. The morning air was crisp as we left the house, and I took care to dress neatly, my shoes polished and my old watch clasped around my wrist, the same watch my wife had given me years ago. I told myself that whatever destination he had planned would be a chance for us to reconnect, father and son, sharing a moment that life had stolen from us too often. The car ride began with chatter that skimmed the surface of real conversation. He asked me if I had been feeling well, if I remembered to take my pills, if I had been eating properly. I answered honestly, but also added little jokes to ease the tension because something in his tone did not sit right with me. There was a hollowness to his questions, a mechanical rhythm, as though he were ticking off boxes on a list rather than speaking to me as his father. I glanced at him more than once, noticing how tightly he gripped the steering wheel, how his jaw clenched and relaxed, how his eyes darted forward with a focus that seemed more about endurance than enjoyment. The streets grew less familiar the further we drove. The buildings changing from the homes and shops I knew into taller structures and wide, sterile parking lots. I asked him where we were going, and he only said, "It's a surprise for your birthday, Dad." The words sounded pleasant, yet they carried no warmth, and still I clung to the hope that he might have found a restaurant we used to visit, or perhaps he had arranged to meet his own children so that I could celebrate surrounded by family. Instead, we pulled into a driveway that made my stomach tighten. It was a wide driveway lined with trimmed hedges and a sign that bore the name of a nursing home. The building itself was neat, the lawn freshly mowed, the windows evenly spaced with curtains drawn, but to me it looked like a prison dressed in polite clothes. My son parked the car and stepped out briskly, moving with a determination that frightened me. He came around to open my door, his hand firm as he guided me out, but his eyes avoided mine, as if he could not bear to see the questions rising in them. I asked softly why we were here, but he only said, "Come inside, Dad, you'll see." The receptionist greeted him warmly, too warmly, as though they had met before. She had papers ready, clipped together, and my son retrieved them from her as if this moment had been arranged long before today. My heart began to pound as he signed his name across each page, his pen moving quickly, his eyes scanning but never hesitating. I felt the room tilt, the truth dawning on me slowly and then all at once. This was not a visit. This was a placement. He was leaving me here, and the realization made my knees weak. I wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, but my voice cracked when I tried. My son finally turned to me, his expression carefully arranged into one of concern that looked more like pity, and he said, "It's for the best, Dad. You cannot manage on your own anymore. You will be taken care of here." I heard the words, but could not accept them. It was my birthday. How could he not see that this was not care but abandonment? I thought of all the nights I had stayed up with him when he was a child, holding his small, feverish body against my chest, praying for his health. I thought of the double shifts I had worked to pay for his schooling, the vacations I never took so that he could have opportunities I never dreamed of. And here I was, handed over to strangers, as if I were a burden to be disposed of. The staff guided me toward a room with walls that smelled faintly of disinfectant, a small bed with thin sheets, and a dresser that stood empty, waiting for the belongings I had not even known I would need. My suitcase, packed under his suggestion, now revealed its cruel purpose. He had planned this betrayal, disguising it as a birthday outing, using the day that should have been filled with love to deliver the deepest wound. When I looked out the window, I saw him walking back to the car. He did not look back, not even once, as he drove away and left me behind. That was the day of betrayal, a day that carved itself into my soul with a sharpness I will never forget. The sting of humiliation settled into my bones that night as I sat alone on the edge of the narrow bed that was now supposed to be mine, and I could not stop thinking about how cruelly the day had unfolded. Birthdays had once meant celebration, laughter, and a gathering of the people I loved most. Yet this one had been stripped of every ounce of dignity and replaced with rejection. I had walked into that building on shaky legs, believing for a moment that perhaps my son had something meaningful planned, only to discover that he had been planning to rid himself of me for longer than I had realized. The humiliation did not strike me all at once. It began in small moments, like when the receptionist looked at me not with respect but with a kind of professional sympathy, the way someone might look at a stray animal that had finally been given a cage. I could feel their eyes on me, their silent judgment that I was one more old man who could no longer manage on his own, one more responsibility handed over because no one at home wanted the burden anymore. The nurse who escorted me to my room spoke gently, her voice soft with practiced kindness. But even that pierced me with shame, because it meant she had done this countless times before, guiding abandoned parents into sterile rooms while their children drove away without looking back. I sat down on the thin mattress, the springs creaking under my weight, and I tried to steady my hands, but they trembled with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. I looked around the room, at the blank walls and the faint smell of bleach, and realized how stripped of identity it all was. Nothing in that room told my story. Nothing in that room spoke of the decades I had lived, the years I had worked, or the family I had built. It was as if my life had been erased and replaced with 4 empty walls and a bed that could have belonged to anyone. The sting grew sharper when I remembered the faces of the residents I had passed in the hallway. Some sat in wheelchairs, staring at nothing. Others shuffled slowly with walkers, their eyes dulled not just by age, but by the weight of being left behind. I realized I had become one of them in the eyes of the world, just another forgotten figure tucked away so that the young could move on unbothered. The humiliation pressed down on me when I thought of my son's children, my grandchildren, who had not even been told that their grandfather would no longer be at home. What would they think when they asked for me and were told I was now living here? Would they think I had chosen it? Would they think I had been too weak to remain with them? Or would they believe the story their father told, a story that painted me as incapable and helpless, a story that excused his actions while erasing my sacrifices? As I sat there, I could feel the shame burning in my chest, because I had always been a man who provided, a man who worked until his body ached just to ensure his family never went without. Now, in the span of a single afternoon, I had been recast as a man unfit to live in his own home. My birthday, which should have been marked with gratitude and love, had instead been used as the perfect disguise for betrayal, and that realization cut me deeper than any blade. I tried to hold back my tears, but the humiliation forced them out, hot and relentless, streaking down my face as I buried my head in my hands. Each tear carried with it a memory of what I had given and what I had lost, and each tear seemed to whisper the cruel truth that I was no longer wanted. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, each second dragging on as if to remind me of the emptiness of the night. I closed my eyes and thought about the dinner table that should have been set at home, perhaps with a small cake, perhaps with laughter echoing through the rooms. Instead, the only sound was the shuffle of nurses in the hallway and the distant television playing in the common room. Humiliation had stolen my dignity, but it also awakened something else deep within me. A quiet anger that began to grow beneath the pain, an ember that whispered that my story was not finished, not yet. As I lay awake in that small room, with its thin mattress and pale curtains, the humiliation of the day still fresh in my chest, my mind wandered back through the corridors of time, and every memory of sacrifice came flooding in until I could not hold them back. I remembered the early years of my marriage, when my wife and I had very little except the fire of determination in our hearts. We lived in a modest house with creaking floors and drafty windows, yet it was filled with laughter and warmth because we believed every struggle was worth it if it built a better life for the child we dreamed of. When my son was born, I stood by the hospital bed, tears in my eyes, holding that tiny bundle against my chest, and silently promising that I would protect him, provide for him, and give him every opportunity I had never been afforded. I kept that promise even when it meant working 2 jobs, even when it meant missing sleep, even when it meant eating less so he could eat more. I worked at the factory during the day, the machines roaring around me, my hands blistered from labor, and at night I took on shifts at the warehouse, lifting heavy boxes until my back screamed in protest. Still, I never complained, because every dollar meant another piece of security for my family. I remembered the nights when I came home long after dark, my clothes soaked in sweat, and found my wife asleep on the couch with our son curled against her. I would stand there quietly, aching from head to toe, but my heart swelling with pride because I knew I was building a foundation for him. There were birthdays when I had only a few coins left in my pocket, yet I found a way to buy him a small toy or a slice of cake so that he would never feel the emptiness I had felt as a child. I sacrificed weekends, vacations, and personal dreams without hesitation. I turned down opportunities to travel or buy things for myself because I believed my son's future mattered more than my own comfort. I remembered the day he wanted to join the school's soccer team and needed new shoes. We did not have the money, but I sold my old watch, the one I had been given when I turned 20, just so he could run across that field with confidence. His smile that day lit up my soul, and I told myself it was worth it. Every bit of pain, every bit of hunger, every long hour I endured. I remembered his schooling, the tuition that seemed impossible to afford, but I found ways to pay. I picked up side work repairing furniture, mowing lawns, and even cleaning offices at night. I put my body through exhaustion because I wanted him to have what I never did, the chance to learn, the chance to rise above, the chance to live free of the chains that had bound me to endless labor. And when he graduated, when I saw him walk across that stage, I clapped until my hands were sore and tears rolled freely down my face. I thought at that moment that every sacrifice had been justified, that one day he would look back and know what I had given, and that he would treat me with respect and gratitude. But as I sat in that nursing home, betrayed on my birthday, I realized how wrong I had been. The memories of sacrifice that had once given me strength now felt like weights pressing on my chest, because they reminded me that all I had given had been forgotten. Still, I could not bring myself to regret those years of devotion. They were who I was, the fabric of my being, the story of my life as a father. And even as pain seared through me, I told myself quietly that sacrifice was never wasted, because it came from love. And love, even when discarded by others, still holds power in the heart of the one who gives it. The memory of my son's cold words still echoes inside me, as if they were carved into the very walls of that nursing home room, and no matter how many times I tried to steady myself, I could not push them away, because they were not just words. They were knives, sharp and deliberate, cutting away the bond that I thought still tied us together. I remember standing in the reception area, still trying to understand what was happening, my suitcase resting by my feet, the smell of disinfectant in the air, and the weight of confusion pressing heavily against my chest. I asked him softly, almost pleading, if this was really necessary, if this was truly what he wanted from me. And he looked me in the eyes with that expression that pretended to be caring, but was stripped of warmth. And he said, "It is for the best, Dad. You cannot manage alone anymore. You will be more comfortable here." Those words were like a final judgment, spoken with the authority of someone who believed he knew better, yet laced with the indifference of a man who had already turned his heart away from me. It was not the statement itself that broke me, but the way he said it, with no hesitation, no crack in his voice, no sign of guilt or struggle, as if he had rehearsed it, as if he had been waiting for this very moment to finally release himself from whatever duty he thought he owed me. I tried to respond, to remind him of all that I had given, of the nights I had stayed awake when he was sick, of the years I had labored to keep a roof over our heads, of the dreams I had quietly buried so he could have his own, but my words faltered because his eyes told me he would not hear them. His eyes were distant, cold, and unyielding. The eyes of a man who saw not a father but a burden to be managed, an inconvenience to be removed from his life. The receptionist glanced at me with pity, but pity was salt in the wound, for it reminded me that everyone around us saw me as powerless, as someone to be pitied rather than respected. I wanted to tell my son that comfort does not come from sterile rooms or polite nurses, that comfort is the sound of family voices, the presence of loved ones, the laughter around a dinner table, but he was already turning away, already signing the last page of the paperwork, already severing the tie that I had spent a lifetime building. His cold words replayed in my mind as I was led down the hallway, each repetition striking harder, making me feel smaller, until I wondered if I truly had become the helpless figure he described. But then I thought of the years when I carried weight heavier than my own body, when I worked shifts back to back without complaint, when I stood tall against hardship because I believed my son's future depended on it, and I knew I was not helpless. I knew I was not weak. I knew that his words were not truth, but a mask to justify his decision. Still, knowing this did not take away the sting, because when a child looks into the eyes of the man who raised him and speaks with such coldness, it is more than abandonment. It is erasure. His words stripped me not just of dignity, but of the illusion that love and gratitude would one day return to me. They rang inside me as I lay in bed that night, louder than the ticking clock, sharper than the creak of footsteps in the hallway. And I found myself whispering them aloud just to hear the sound. "It is for the best, Dad. You cannot manage alone anymore." Each time I repeated them, they felt heavier, as if I were being buried beneath their weight. And yet, deep inside, as painful as those cold words were, I began to feel a shift, a quiet stirring of defiance, a whisper that told me his judgment would not be the final word of my story, because life still had a way of reminding us that fate can turn in the most unexpected ways. The loneliness of the home struck me in a way I could never have imagined, for it was not simply the absence of familiar voices or the emptiness of a house once filled with laughter. It was the deep, suffocating silence that settled around me like a heavy blanket, pressing against my chest until I struggled to breathe. My room was small and plain, the kind of place that stripped a man of identity, with white walls that seemed to absorb every sound and reflect nothing back. At night, I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights in the hallway, the shuffle of slippers on linoleum floors, and the occasional cough from a stranger in the room next door, and all of it combined into a reminder that I was no longer in my home, but in a place designed for people to wait out the end of their days. I had never thought of myself as lonely before, even after my wife passed, because at least I still had my memories and the warmth of family visits. But here in the nursing home, loneliness became a constant companion, sitting with me at every meal, following me into the common room and crawling into bed with me at night. Meals were served on plastic trays, identical portions handed out to everyone, and though the staff tried to smile and greet us kindly, I could feel the lack of personal touch. No one knew what I liked. No one asked about the dishes my wife once cooked. No one remembered the little things that made me feel seen. I would sit among the other residents, many of whom stared blankly at the television or nodded off in their chairs, and I would ache for a real conversation, for someone to ask about my life, about the man I once was before I became just another patient. The loneliness grew sharper whenever I thought of my son, of the home I once had, of the empty chair at the dinner table that should have been filled by me. I imagined my grandchildren laughing in the yard, asking where Grandpa was, and I wondered what lies or half-truths they were told to explain my absence. Perhaps they were told I was better off here. Perhaps they were told I wanted this. But I knew the truth, and the truth was that I had been discarded. In the evenings, I would walk slowly down the hallways, looking at the faded photographs hanging on the walls, pictures of smiling elderly people at parties, as though to convince us that life here was joyful. But all I could see was the emptiness behind the images, the attempt to disguise what was really a place of waiting. Some residents spoke quietly about their families, but many said nothing at all, their eyes tired from years of neglect. I realized then that loneliness was not just about being physically alone, it was about being forgotten, and that realization cut me deeper than anything else. I longed for the sound of my wife's voice, the comfort of her hand resting on mine, the simple joy of sharing a cup of coffee at our kitchen table, and I longed for the days when my son would run into my arms after school, his laughter filling the house. Now, there was nothing but the sterile quiet of the nursing home, broken only by the mechanical ticking of the clock above my bed. I tried to fill the silence by remembering stories from my past, whispering them to myself so that at least someone would hear them, even if it was only me. Yet the loneliness clung to me with persistence, reminding me each moment that I had been placed here not out of love, but out of convenience. Still, as heavy as the loneliness was, I also felt the faintest stirring of something else, a quiet resilience. Because even in the silence I told myself I was still alive, and as long as I drew breath, my story was not finished. In the midst of that crushing loneliness, when every day felt like an endless repetition of silence and every night pressed down on me with the weight of abandonment, there came a flicker of kindness that pierced through the darkness, like a small but steady flame. And it came from one of the nurses who worked the evening shift. Her name was Clara, a young woman with gentle eyes that seemed to carry more compassion than the sterile walls around us could contain, and though she did not know the details of my story, she treated me with a dignity that reminded me I was still a man and not just a patient. The first time I noticed it was during dinner, when she set my tray down not with hurried movements like the others, but with a soft smile, asking me if I wanted an extra piece of bread because she remembered I had left mine untouched the night before. It was such a small gesture, yet it startled me because it had been so long since anyone had noticed what I liked or what I needed. I thanked her, my voice rough with emotion, and she simply nodded, as if it was the most natural thing in the world to pay attention to an old man's preferences. Over the days that followed, her kindness continued in quiet ways. She would stop by my room in the evenings to ask how I was settling in, not in the mechanical tone of someone checking a box on a list, but with genuine curiosity, waiting patiently for my answers, and even laughing softly when I made a joke to cover my sadness. One night, when I could not sleep and sat awake staring at the clock, she found me in the hallway and walked with me slowly until I grew tired enough to return to bed, and in that walk she spoke about her own grandfather, how she had cared for him in his final years, and how she had promised herself she would never let another person in her care feel invisible. Hearing her words brought a lump to my throat because it reminded me of the love I once knew from my wife, the kind of love that was not earned through obligation but offered freely from the heart. Clara's kindness did not erase the betrayal I had suffered, nor did it take away the loneliness that lingered in the corners of my room, but it gave me something I had thought I had lost entirely, a sense of being seen. Even in moments when despair threatened to swallow me, I found myself holding on to the memory of her voice, the softness in her eyes, and the way she spoke to me not as a burden but as a person with a story worth listening to. I began to realize that sometimes one flicker of kindness can light a path through even the darkest corridors, and though I did not know it then, her presence was the first thread that began stitching back together the pieces of my spirit. Each day when she passed my room, she would wave or stop to ask if I had everything I needed, and I found myself waiting for those brief encounters because they reminded me that life still held moments of grace, however fleeting. The other residents noticed it too, how she carried herself with patience and warmth, and often I saw them brighten when she entered the room, as though her very presence lifted the heavy air we all breathed. In her kindness, I found not just comfort, but a fragile seed of hope, the reminder that even though my own son had turned cold, the world still held hearts capable of tenderness. And that seed, small as it was, began to grow quietly inside me, preparing me for the unexpected turn my life was about to take. As I sat in that small room that had become my reluctant dwelling, the flicker of kindness from Clara still lingering in my heart, I often drifted into memories of better days, days when life felt full and meaningful, days when laughter echoed through the walls of my home, and the world seemed warmer simply because my family was near. I remembered birthdays from years long gone, when my wife would bustle in the kitchen, her apron dusted with flour, humming softly as she baked the simplest of cakes that tasted like heaven to me because it was made with her hands. She would bring it out with a single candle placed in the center, and my young son, his eyes wide with excitement, would lean forward to blow it out before I even had the chance, laughing as the flame flickered out while I pretended to scold him. Those were nights filled with joy, with the clinking of forks on plates, with the warmth of my wife's hand resting on mine, with the sight of my son grinning as he smeared frosting across his cheeks. I remembered summer evenings when we would sit out on the porch, my wife beside me, my son running barefoot through the yard catching fireflies, and I would think to myself that life had given me more than I ever deserved. There were winters, too, cold and bitter outside, but inside our little home we would gather close around the fire, my wife knitting quietly, my son playing with his toys, and I would read stories aloud, watching the wonder in his eyes as if the whole world could be contained in that one small room. Those were the moments that stitched my soul together, the ones that gave meaning to every sacrifice I had ever made, and even now, as I sat surrounded by strangers and sterile walls, I clung to those memories as though they were treasures that no one could steal. I remembered the pride I felt watching my son take his first steps, the way he wobbled toward me with arms outstretched, and the way my wife clapped and laughed with tears in her eyes. I remembered his first day of school, how he clung to my hand nervously until I promised him he would be fine, and how I stood outside the classroom window longer than I should have just to be sure he was safe. I remembered the family dinners, the smell of roast chicken filling the air, the sound of my son talking endlessly about his day, his dreams, his plans, and how I always told him he could become anything if he worked hard enough. These were the better days, the days when I believed our bond was unbreakable, the days when I felt certain that the love we shared would carry us through every storm. Even after my wife passed, I held on to those memories as a shield against loneliness, believing that my son and I still carried her spirit with us, that her love remained alive in the way we cared for one another. Yet sitting in that nursing home, abandoned on my birthday, I could not help but see the cruel contrast between the boy I remembered and the man who had left me behind. Still, the memories of better days gave me strength because they reminded me of who I was, of the life I had built, of the love I had poured into my family. They reminded me that I had once known true joy, and that even if it had been lost in the present, it was real and it belonged to me. In those moments of reflection, I realized that memory itself could be a refuge, a place where betrayal could not reach me. And so I closed my eyes and returned to those golden days again and again, holding tightly to the sound of laughter, the touch of love, and the peace of knowing that once, even if only for a time, I had been cherished. It was during one of those long and lonely evenings, when the television in the common room droned with programs no one truly watched, and the ticking clock in my small room seemed louder than my own heartbeat, that I remembered the lottery ticket tucked away in my wallet, a slip of paper so ordinary that I had nearly forgotten it even existed. I had bought it weeks earlier at the corner store near my house, back when I still believed my son would be taking me home after our little outing, back when I still thought birthdays were meant to be spent with family and not with strangers in matching slippers. I had not purchased it with any real hope of winning, for I had never been a man lucky with such things. But it had been one of those impulses born out of habit, the cashier asking if I wanted to try my luck, and me handing over a few spare coins without much thought. That ticket had sat quietly in my wallet through the betrayal, through the humiliation, through the nights of loneliness, until suddenly I remembered it, and the thought of it became a distraction, something to focus on, besides the ache in my chest. I pulled it out slowly, smoothing the creases with my fingers, staring at the rows of numbers as though they carried some secret message only I could see. At first, I laughed at myself. An old man sitting alone in a nursing home, clinging to a lottery ticket as if it were a lifeline. But then I realized it was not the numbers that mattered. It was the feeling of possibility, the small whisper of chance that maybe life still had a surprise left for me. I placed the ticket carefully on the table beside my bed, promising myself I would check it when the time came, and for the first time since my birthday, I felt a spark of anticipation rather than dread. Each night that week, I found myself glancing at that ticket as though it were a silent companion, as though it were reminding me that not everything had been decided, that fate could still twist in ways neither I nor my son could imagine. I remembered my wife's voice telling me once that fortune favors the persistent, that life often saves its most unexpected gifts for those who endure the longest, and I found comfort in that thought. Holding the ticket in my hand, I thought of all the things I could do if by some miracle it turned out to be a winner. I could reclaim my dignity. I could prove to my son that I was not the helpless figure he believed me to be. I could help others who truly understood the value of kindness like Clara, and I could honor the memory of my wife by using the money for good rather than greed. The more I thought about it, the more the ticket became more than just paper. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder that my story was not yet finished, that perhaps life had been saving a final twist for me. Even if it amounted to nothing, even if the numbers brought no fortune, the very existence of the ticket lifted me from despair and gave me something to hold on to in the silence. I tucked it back into my wallet with a care usually reserved for sacred objects, whispering to myself that one day soon I would see whether fate had truly remembered me. That little slip of paper, forgotten by me for so long, was about to change everything, though I did not yet know how drastically, and as I lay back on the thin mattress staring at the ceiling, I felt a calm I had not known in weeks. Because for the first time since being left behind, I dared to believe that perhaps my best days were not over. Perhaps they were waiting just around the corner. The discovery came on an afternoon that began as ordinary as any other in that quiet and suffocating nursing home, an afternoon where the hours stretched endlessly, and the sounds of shuffling feet and muted televisions filled the hallways. But that day would mark a shift in my life so profound that even now I struggle to describe the feeling of it. I had been sitting by the window in my room, staring out at the garden where a few residents moved slowly between the benches, their heads bent as if weighed down by years of sorrow, when I suddenly remembered that the lottery numbers had been drawn the night before. My heart gave a sudden thud in my chest as I reached for my wallet, my fingers trembling slightly as I pulled out the crumpled ticket that had been my secret companion in the lonely night since my abandonment. I laid it flat on the table and smoothed it out with care, the numbers glaring back at me like a code waiting to be broken. I turned on the small television in the corner of my room, flipping through the channels until I found the recording of the draw, the numbers appearing one by one across the screen. My eyes darted from the ticket in my hand to the television, my breath catching with each match, my mind struggling to believe what it was seeing. The first number aligned, then the second, and by the third my hands were shaking so hard that I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. By the time the final number appeared and stood perfectly in line with those printed on my ticket, a wave of disbelief washed over me so strong that I nearly laughed aloud. I had won. Against every odd, against every expectation, I had won. I sat there in silence for a long time, the truth struggling to settle inside me, and I thought of the irony, how just 1 week earlier I had been discarded by my own son, told I was incapable, told I was better off forgotten, and now I was holding in my hand the key to a fortune that could change everything. My heart pounded as if it wanted to leap out of my chest, my throat tight with emotions I could not name, a strange mixture of joy, vindication, and disbelief all at once. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling, whispering to myself that it could not be real. Yet the numbers did not lie. The ticket did not lie. And fate itself had decided to place this gift in my hands. Memories of all the sacrifices I had made, all the humiliations I had endured, all the nights I had spent aching from betrayal surged through me, and now here I was, holding a future no one expected. For a long moment I thought of my wife, wishing she had been there to see this moment, imagining the smile she would have worn and the pride she would have felt, and I whispered a quiet thank you to her, as though her spirit had guided me to this miracle. I thought, too, of Clara, the nurse who had shown me kindness when no one else did, and how perhaps this win was not just for me, but a chance to honor people like her who saw the humanity in others. My son's face also flashed in my mind, the cold words he had spoken, the way he had driven away without looking back, and I felt a strange calm, because now I held something that would reveal his true nature, something that would test the character he had chosen to abandon. The discovery filled me not only with joy, but with a renewed sense of purpose, for I knew then that my life was far from over, that I was not the helpless old man he believed me to be, and that the story of my revenge had just begun. The moment I discovered that my lottery ticket was a winner, the kind of win that could change the course of a man's life forever, I felt an almost overwhelming urge to shout it to the world, to run down the hallways of the nursing home and tell everyone that the old man who had been abandoned and humiliated was now holding a fortune in his hands. But I stopped myself, because almost immediately a second thought arrived, sharper and steadier than the first, and it told me that I had to keep this to myself. That thought grew into a secret resolve, a firm decision that no one, not even the kind nurse who had shown me kindness, would know until I was ready for them to know. I folded the ticket carefully and slipped it back into my wallet, my heart still racing, but my mind already racing faster with the possibilities of what I could do and how I could use this gift. I thought of my son and how quickly he would return if he discovered the truth, how he would walk into this home with feigned concern, his voice dripping with false affection, pretending to care when all he would want was to put his hands on money that was not his. I thought of the way he had spoken to me, telling me it was for the best, telling me I could not manage alone, leaving me here as though I were a piece of furniture no longer useful, and I knew that if he found out about this win, he would try to claim it, perhaps even argue that as his father I had a duty to give it to him. The very idea sickened me, and so I decided right then that silence would be my shield. I would tell no one until I had secured everything in place, until I had spoken to the right people who could help me protect it. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and I planned. I thought of lawyers who could guide me, financial advisors who could shield my winnings behind walls of law and paperwork, and I thought of how I could use this fortune not for selfish indulgence, but as a tool for justice, as a way to rewrite the story that my son thought he had already ended. My resolve grew stronger with each passing hour, and I promised myself that I would not allow betrayal to touch this gift. I would guard it fiercely. I would build it into something that no greedy hands could take, and I would do it all quietly, wearing the mask of the helpless old man my son believed me to be. In the nursing home, I continued my days as before, walking slowly down the halls, eating my meals in silence, pretending to watch television, all while inside I carried the knowledge of my fortune and the weight of my plan. When Clara asked me one evening why I seemed lighter, why I looked as if a burden had been lifted, I only smiled and told her I had been remembering better days. She accepted that answer with her usual kindness, never pushing me, and in that moment I realized that even kindness must not tempt me into confession, for secrecy was the only way to preserve what I now held. My resolve hardened further. When I imagined the humiliation on my son's face, when he would one day learn that the father he had cast aside had risen not just with dignity but with wealth so vast, it would leave him speechless. I would not waste this gift on him, not 1 cent, because he had shown me what I truly meant to him, and now it was time I showed him what his betrayal had cost. This secret resolve became my strength, my armor, and each day I carried it with me in silence, knowing that my time was coming, that fate had given me a second chance to reclaim not only my life, but my pride. While I carried my secret resolve like armor close to my chest, outside in the world my son walked around boasting to others about how well he had taken care of me, and his ignorance of the truth was both bitter and strangely satisfying to witness through the whispers that reached me. Relatives called the nursing home occasionally to ask how I was doing, and in their voices I could hear the second-hand stories they had been fed, stories crafted by my son, in which he painted himself as the dutiful child who had made a difficult but noble choice to place his father in a safe and comfortable environment. He told them I was happy here, that I was being looked after by professionals, that I had everything I needed and no longer had to worry about anything. What he left out, of course, was the fact that he had abandoned me here on my birthday, without a shred of compassion, without a backward glance, without even a call in the days after to check on my well-being. I heard from one of my cousins, who had spoken with him at a family gathering, that he bragged about how he had done the responsible thing and that now he could finally focus on his own household without the burden of caring for an aging father. The word burden stung when I heard it repeated, but it also reminded me why I had chosen silence about the lottery win. In his ignorance, my son had no idea that the man he had labeled a burden was now sitting on a fortune that could outmatch his entire life's earnings, a fortune that could have transformed his family's future if he had only chosen love over greed, if he had chosen patience over abandonment. Instead, he walked around ignorant and arrogant, convincing himself and others that he had made the best choice, completely blind to the truth that fate had already handed me a way to rise above him. I imagined him speaking so confidently, puffing out his chest, telling anyone who would listen that his father was well provided for and that he had nothing left to give. And I could not help but smile to myself in the quiet of my room, because every word he spoke only deepened the irony of what was to come. He did not call me, he did not visit me, and he did not suspect for a moment that the man he had locked away in this place had become wealthier than he could ever hope to be. His ignorance was my shield, his arrogance my protection, and I let him continue in it because the longer he believed I was powerless, the sweeter the revelation would be when it came. Each day I walked through the nursing home halls with the quiet dignity of a man who knew something no one else did, and each night I lay in bed thinking of how my son's ignorance gave me time to prepare, to build my plan carefully without interference. I thought of how he would react when the truth finally surfaced, how the same man who had signed me away with cold words would be forced to look at me differently, and how the lies he had told others about my helplessness would crumble into dust. His ignorance allowed me to become invisible, and in that invisibility I found strength. I was the forgotten man, but in truth I was the one who held all the power, and the day was coming when his ignorance would turn into humiliation so deep that he would never forget it. With my son living in ignorance and the lottery ticket now secured as proof that fate had not abandoned me, I began to shape a plan in the quiet of my nights, a plan that would not only protect my fortune, but also ensure that the betrayal I had suffered would not go unanswered. At first, the thoughts came in fragments, drifting through my mind as I stared at the ceiling in the dim glow of the hallway lights, but slowly they began to take form, solid and deliberate, like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. I knew that the first step was secrecy, and so I kept my behavior unchanged, never letting the staff suspect that anything in my life had shifted. I ate the same bland meals, walked the same halls, and smiled politely when spoken to, all the while carrying inside me the knowledge that I was no longer a man stripped of choices, but one preparing to wield control in a way that would astonish those who had written me off. The second step was protection, and for that I would need guidance, so I reached out quietly to an old friend of mine who still worked at a law firm, asking him to visit me under the guise of catching up. When he arrived, I spoke to him in careful tones, laying out the truth of my win and the betrayal I had endured, and he looked at me with astonishment before nodding firmly, promising that there were legal paths to secure every cent beyond the reach of greedy hands. His advice became the foundation of my plan. He suggested creating trusts, setting up accounts that my son could never penetrate, and channeling funds into causes that would honor my wife's memory and support people who truly understood the meaning of care. I listened intently, my heart swelling with a sense of control I had not felt in years. The third step was patience, for I knew that my son would eventually learn of my fortune through whispers or chance, and when he did, his greed would drive him straight back to me. I wanted to be ready for that moment, to face him not as the helpless old man he believed me to be, but as a father who had reclaimed his dignity and outwitted him. In the meantime, I continued to build the details of my plan. I asked my lawyer friend to introduce me to a financial advisor he trusted, a man whose reputation was spotless and whose loyalty could be secured, and together we began to map out how the money could be managed. We spoke of investments that would grow, donations that would leave a legacy, and protections that would ensure my son could never twist the law to his advantage. I felt alive again, my mind sharp and focused, as though the years of being dismissed had peeled away to reveal the man I once was, capable, determined, and relentless. My plan was not only about money, it was about justice, about showing my son that the man he cast aside was stronger than he ever imagined. Each night as I reviewed the details, I felt a sense of satisfaction that warmed me even in the cold sterility of the nursing home, because I knew I was building toward a moment that would change everything. My son believed I was powerless, but in truth, I was orchestrating his greatest lesson, and the day would come when he would stand before me and realize the cost of his betrayal. The plan formed piece by piece, until it was no longer just an idea, but a strategy etched firmly into my resolve, and I carried it like a hidden treasure, knowing that soon it would serve its purpose. Once the plan had taken shape in my mind and the foundations had been set with the help of my lawyer and the financial advisor, I moved into a stage of silent preparation, a period where I lived each day outwardly, as though nothing in my life had changed, while inwardly I was orchestrating every detail of a future my son could not touch. The key to success was patience, and so I masked my growing strength behind the frailty he had assigned to me, walking slowly down the nursing home halls with the appearance of a man resigned to his fate. While in truth my thoughts were sharp and precise, each step of the plan unfolding in secret. I arranged meetings quietly, always under the cover of friendship or routine visits, and no one suspected that in those quiet hours I was signing documents that shielded millions under ironclad trusts, ensuring that not a penny could slip into the greedy hands of the man who had abandoned me. I maintained correspondence with my lawyer through carefully coded letters, the kind that would mean nothing to a casual reader but carried clear instructions for him, and in that way I was able to make progress without drawing attention. Even Clara, whose kindness had been a light in my darkest days, did not know the truth, though at times I wanted to share it with her just to see her smile at the thought of my good fortune. But I held back, because silence was my protection and secrecy was my weapon. I pretended to be engaged with the mundane rhythms of the nursing home, attending meal times, participating in the occasional group activity, and keeping my head bowed during the prayers offered by the chaplain. But behind that mask, I was preparing investments, drafting wills, and securing accounts in places my son could never reach. The act of silent preparation became almost a game, and each day I found satisfaction in knowing that I was building an empire of security right under the noses of those who thought I had been stripped of power. I arranged for donations to be set aside for hospitals, scholarships to be created in my wife's name, and funds to be directed toward causes that reflected the values she and I had cherished. Every detail was considered, every possibility accounted for, and the more I worked, the more I felt my dignity returning to me, not just as a man with money, but as a man with purpose. My son continued in his ignorance, spreading his story to relatives, boasting about how he had responsibly placed me in a safe environment, never once realizing that the father he thought he had disposed of was quietly transforming his destiny in silence. I knew the day would come when word of my fortune would reach him, for money of such magnitude cannot remain hidden forever, and I welcomed the thought, because by then my silent preparations would be complete and every door he tried to force open would slam in his face. There was a satisfaction in knowing that my revenge did not require loud declarations or dramatic confrontations, only patience and precision. And as I moved through each day, pretending to be the frail man he believed I was, I smiled inside at the irony that my silence was the most powerful sound of all. Each signature I placed, each instruction I gave, each account I secured was a step toward freedom, and I told myself over and over that the sweetest revenge was not anger, but success carried out quietly until the moment of revelation. Silent preparation became my strength, and I carried it with me like a secret fire, warming me in the cold nights and guiding me toward the day when the truth would be revealed. It was inevitable that the whispers would eventually reach my son, for money of such magnitude has a way of slipping through even the smallest cracks, and so the day came when he finally appeared at the nursing home, walking through the front doors, with that same polished smile he used to wear whenever he wanted something from me, the kind of smile that was practiced enough to fool strangers, but transparent enough that I could see straight through it. I had been expecting this moment, had even rehearsed it in the quiet of my mind during the long nights when I lay awake planning, but still my heart beat faster as I saw him step into the reception area, his shoulders squared, as if he had come not to visit, but to reclaim something he believed was his. The staff greeted him warmly, unaware of the history between us, and he walked toward me with arms spread wide as though he were a loving son who had missed his father. But I noticed the flicker of calculation in his eyes, the way they scanned my face, my clothes, even my room, as if trying to gauge how much truth there was to the rumors he had heard. He embraced me lightly, a quick squeeze that carried no warmth, and then pulled back to study me. "Dad," he said with a voice that sounded just a touch too sweet, "I heard you have been doing well. I thought I should come see you." I nodded, keeping my expression calm, though inside I was already bracing for the inevitable request, the inevitable attempt to grasp what he believed had slipped from his hands. We sat together in the small lounge, the chairs stiff, and the air filled with the faint smell of disinfectant, and he tried to speak casually about his life, about his children, about his work, but his words trailed off as he leaned forward, lowering his voice, and finally asked the question he had come for. "Dad, I heard something," he said, his eyes narrowing. "I heard you came into some money. Is that true?" I watched him carefully, noting the way his hands gripped the armrest, the way his jaw tensed, and I let a silence stretch between us before I responded. I told him simply that I was comfortable, nothing more, and the disappointment in his eyes flickered for just a second before he leaned back and forced another smile. He tried to mask his greed with concern, asking if I needed help managing my affairs, if I had someone trustworthy advising me, if I was sure I could handle everything on my own. I listened, my face calm, but inside I almost laughed at the irony. For this was the same man who had told me I could not manage alone, the same man who had signed me into this home as though I were incapable of making decisions, and now he was sitting in front of me pretending to be the protective son. I answered him with measured words, assuring him that everything was taken care of, and though I did not reveal the details, I could see his frustration mounting behind the mask of politeness. He asked again, pressing harder, wanting to know figures, names, accounts, and I let him circle around me like a wolf sniffing at the edges of a trap it could not see. His visit stretched on, filled with his forced laughter and false concern, but I knew exactly why he was there and what he wanted, and I took satisfaction in knowing that every time he reached for the subject, every time he probed for information, I gave him nothing but vague answers. By the time he left, his smile had tightened, his words had grown shorter, and his eyes had darkened with the realization that I was not the weak and oblivious old man he believed me to be. I watched him walk out the same doors he had once left me behind through, and this time I felt no sting of betrayal, only the quiet satisfaction that my silence and preparation had rendered his visit meaningless. The confrontation I had long anticipated came sooner than I expected, for my son was never one to accept silence without pushing harder, and only a few days after his first visit he returned, this time with no mask of casual concern, no polite small talk, and no attempt to disguise the hunger in his eyes. He marched into my room with a determination that filled the air like a storm about to break, and I knew immediately that this was the moment when his greed would finally bare its teeth. He did not even greet me properly, only closed the door behind him and stood over me as I sat in the chair by the window, his voice sharp and impatient as he said, "Dad, enough games? I know about the lottery. I know you won, and I deserve to know what you plan to do with it." I looked up at him calmly, my hands folded on my lap, and I let his words hang in the air for a moment before I responded, because I wanted him to feel the weight of his own desperation. He began pacing the room, his words spilling out in a rush, telling me how he was my only son, how everything I had was supposed to pass to him one day, how I could not possibly manage such a fortune alone, and how it was only right that he be given control of it. I listened without interrupting, letting him reveal himself in all his greed, his face flushed, his voice rising, his gestures growing sharper with each sentence. When he finally stopped and stood in front of me again demanding an answer, I spoke slowly and evenly, telling him that the money was mine, that it had been won by me, and that I had already arranged for it to be placed in trusts and accounts that could not be touched without my permission. His face twisted with shock and anger, and for the first time I saw the mask of politeness shatter completely, leaving behind the raw and selfish truth of the man he had become. He leaned closer, his voice lowering to a threatening whisper, accusing me of being selfish, of not thinking of my family, of hoarding wealth I did not deserve. I met his gaze steadily, and reminded him that family was not about money, it was about love and loyalty, two things he had abandoned when he left me here on my birthday. His words faltered for just a moment, as if my reminder had struck a nerve, but then his anger surged back stronger, and he demanded again that I give him access, insisting that as his only child it was his right. I stood slowly, my body aching but my spirit strong, and I told him firmly that rights are earned through respect, not through betrayal, and that his actions had already spoken louder than any claim he could make. The silence that followed was thick, The kind of silence that reveals truths no one wants to say aloud, and he stared at me with a mix of fury and disbelief, realizing that I was not the weak and compliant figure he had imagined. I could see the humiliation flicker in his eyes as he struggled to find words, and I let the moment stretch until he finally turned away, his shoulders rigid, his breath unsteady. The confrontation ended with him storming out, the door slamming behind him, but I felt no fear and no regret, only a deep sense of peace, because I had faced him with the truth and held my ground. In that moment I knew that whatever storm he might bring next, I was ready. For my dignity had been restored and my resolve unshaken. The reveal came in the quiet aftermath of that stormy confrontation, a moment I had envisioned countless times as I lay awake in the sterile silence of the nursing home, and when it finally unfolded, it was both calm and devastating, not because I raised my voice or sought to humiliate my son directly, but because the truth itself carried a weight heavier than anything I could have shouted. He had returned again, his face drawn and his patience stripped away, no longer pretending to be the dutiful son, but fully exposing himself as the man driven by greed and entitlement. He demanded once more that I give him access, his voice shaking not with sorrow or shame, but with desperation, as though the fortune he believed should be his had already begun to slip through his fingers. I sat in the chair, by the window, the same place where I had first realized the depth of his betrayal, and I waited until his words had spilled out, until his anger had filled the room, before I finally lifted my eyes to meet his. In that steady moment, I told him the truth he least wanted to hear. I explained that the money, every cent of it, had already been secured in trusts and foundations that no one but me could touch, and that when my time came it would not flow into his pockets, but into causes and people more deserving. I told him I had arranged scholarships in his mother's name, donations for hospitals that cared for the sick, and funds to support children whose futures depended on opportunity rather than greed. I told him that the fortune had been transformed into a legacy, one that would honor the sacrifices I had made and the love I had once shared with his mother, and that none of it, not a single dollar, would fall into the hands of a man who had abandoned his father without remorse. His face went pale at first, then red, and I saw the shift in his eyes as the truth settled into him, the realization that his scheme, his arrogance, his easy confidence in my weakness had all been outplayed. He sputtered with disbelief, trying to argue, trying to accuse me of being cruel, of being vindictive, of being ungrateful for the life he claimed he had given me by placing me in this home, but his words bounced off me like stones thrown against a wall. I reminded him in a voice calm and unwavering that I had lived my life for him, that every sacrifice I had made had been for his benefit, but that he had repaid it with betrayal, and betrayal does not earn reward, it earns consequence. The reveal was not in the numbers on the lottery ticket, nor in the wealth I now commanded, but in the fact that I had chosen to rise above his selfishness and use my fortune for something greater than his shallow ambitions. I watched him struggle with the humiliation, his hands clenching at his sides, his lips trembling as he searched for words that could undo what he had just heard. But there were none, for the truth stood unshakable before him. At last he turned away, muttering under his breath, his posture bent under the weight of his own failure, and I felt a wave of quiet satisfaction wash over me, not the gloating kind, but the deep peace of a man who had finally spoken the words that needed to be said. The reveal was my victory, not because I had won money, but because I had taken back my power, and as I sat alone once more in the silence of my room, I felt the burden of years of sacrifice and betrayal lift from my shoulders, leaving only the steady knowledge that I had given my son the lesson he would never forget. The humiliation that washed over my son in the wake of my reveal was unlike anything I had ever witnessed before, and though I had not sought to destroy him with my words, the truth itself had done what years of my silence could not, stripping him of the arrogant confidence he wore like armor and leaving him raw and exposed. When I told him that every cent of my winnings had already been secured, that none of it would ever flow into his hands, I saw his face crumble in ways he could not conceal. His mouth opened and closed as though searching for words, but only fragments escaped, accusations that sounded hollow even to his own ears. He called me unfair. He called me selfish. He even tried to accuse me of being manipulated by others. But his voice trembled, and each word revealed not strength, but desperation. The staff in the nursing home could not help but overhear, for his voice had risen in the hallway after he stormed from my room, and soon enough the whispers spread. Those who had believed his stories of being the dutiful son now saw him red-faced and shouting, demanding access to wealth he thought was his birthright. And in that moment, his carefully built facade began to unravel. I remained calm, walking slowly after him, letting him vent his rage before the quiet eyes of strangers. And when I finally spoke, my voice steady and low, I told him again that family is proven through love and loyalty, not through demands and greed. The silence that followed was heavy, for everyone present could see the contrast between us. The father who had been abandoned but stood with dignity, and the son who had betrayed but now stood humiliated by his own hunger. His humiliation deepened as he realized no argument could sway me, no raised voice could force my hand, and no onlookers would side with him once the truth was laid bare. He had thought himself clever, thought himself in control. But the sight of his father, standing taller in spirit than he ever imagined, was a blow greater than any fortune could mend. I watched him grasp at excuses, his words growing weaker as he claimed he had only wanted to protect me, that he had only wanted what was best, but the look in his eyes betrayed him, for greed cannot mask itself forever. And everyone who saw him that day knew what lay beneath. His humiliation was not only in the loss of money, but in the exposure of his character, revealed not by my accusations, but by his own desperate actions. I did not need to shout. I did not need to argue. I only needed to stand firm, and the weight of his own choices bore down on him heavier than anything I could impose. As he finally turned to leave, shoulders hunched, steps hurried, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and vindication. Sorrow that the boy I had once raised with love had become this man, but vindication that life itself had given me the chance to stand before him, not as a victim, but as a victor. The humiliation he carried out of that building would follow him, for every relative he had boasted to, every friend he had deceived, and every person who had believed in his narrative would now see him in a new light, the greedy son who abandoned his father and lost everything because of it. I did not rejoice in his humiliation, but I accepted it as justice, a mirror reflecting back to him the choices he had made. And as I watched him disappear through the same doors he had once left me behind, I knew he would never forget this moment. For humiliation lingers longer than pride, and the lesson had been delivered in a way no amount of denial could erase. The moment of my triumph did not arrive with fanfare or celebration, nor did it need to, because triumph for me was not about the sound of applause or the glow of admiration. It was about the quiet restoration of dignity, the reclaiming of the power my son thought he had stripped from me, and the peace that came from knowing I had turned betrayal into victory. When I walked out of that nursing home, not as a man discarded, but as a man secure in his fortune and stronger in spirit than I had been in years. I felt the weight of humiliation lift from my shoulders. My steps were slow but steady, each one a reminder that I was no longer confined to the role of the helpless old man my son had tried to write into the last chapter of my life. I had taken control back, and with it I carried the sweet knowledge that my life would not end in bitterness but in triumph. The money I had won was not the essence of that triumph, though it gave me the means to secure my future. What truly marked my victory was the choice to use it with intention, to ensure that my wife's memory would be honored, that children who needed opportunities would find them, and that kindness like Clara's would never go unrewarded. I arranged for donations to the hospital that had cared for my wife during her final days. I funded scholarships for students from families like mine who had known the struggles of scraping by, and I established trusts that would outlast me. Each one a testament that love, not greed, was the true legacy worth leaving behind. Every signature I placed on those documents, every agreement I finalized with my advisors, felt like another stone laid in the foundation of my triumph. A fortress built not of walls, but of justice and purpose. Meanwhile, my son, stripped of his lies and burdened with the humiliation of his exposure, was left to reckon with the emptiness of his choices. I did not need to raise my voice or seek revenge in cruelty, because his own actions had undone him, and the truth had humiliated him far more deeply than anything I could have planned. My triumph was not in his downfall, but in my rise, the rise of a man who had been betrayed and forgotten, yet who found within himself the strength to stand taller than ever before. As I left the nursing home for the last time, Clara walked with me to the door, her eyes shining with tears she tried to hide. And though I could not tell her the full extent of what I carried with me, I pressed her hand gently and told her that kindness never goes unnoticed. She smiled, and I knew in that moment that even small gestures of humanity can ripple farther than we ever realize. Outside, the air was cool and fresh, the sky stretching wide above me, and I took a deep breath, as though inhaling freedom itself. I thought of my wife and whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude, believing she had guided me through the darkness into this light. I thought, too, of the countless sacrifices I had made over the years, the nights of exhaustion, the days of toil, the dreams set aside, and I realized that though betrayal had sought to erase them, triumph had restored their meaning. I was no longer the man left behind on his birthday, no longer the man discarded in a sterile room, no longer the man whose son's cold words echoed as truth. I was a man who had endured, who had risen, and who had proven that dignity can never be taken away unless we allow it. My triumph was quiet, but it was complete. And as I walked forward into the life that awaited me, I carried with me the certainty that the best revenge is not anger or bitterness, but living fully, freely, and with purpose. As I sit now and reflect on everything that has happened, I find myself arriving at the final word of this story, the word that ties together the grief, the betrayal, the humiliation, the discovery, and ultimately the triumph that defined these past months of my life. It still astonishes me to think that the very day which marked my deepest heartbreak, the day my own son left me at a nursing home on my birthday, became the turning point that led me toward a destiny no one could have imagined, not even me. At first I thought that betrayal would be the last chapter of my life, that I would fade away quietly in a room filled with strangers, forgotten by the very person I had given everything to raise. But fate has a way of surprising us, and it placed in my hands not only wealth, but an opportunity to reclaim myself. Winning the lottery was never about the numbers or the money. It was about the chance to transform despair into purpose, to take something that could have destroyed me and instead use it to build a legacy of meaning. My son's betrayal cut me deeply, but in that wound I discovered strength, and in that strength I discovered the clarity to see what truly matters. Family is not defined by blood alone. It is defined by love, loyalty, and kindness. And I found more family in the compassion of a nurse who listened to me than in the son who abandoned me when I needed him most. The final word is not bitterness, though I would have every reason to cling to it. Nor is it vengeance, though my son's humiliation was a natural consequence of his greed. The final word is peace. Peace in knowing that I rose above the cruelty, peace in knowing that I took my winnings and secured them in ways that will serve others long after I am gone. Peace in knowing that my wife's memory will live on not in sadness, but in the opportunities given to others in her name. When I think of my son now, I do not feel rage, though I once did. Instead, I feel sorrow for the man he has become, blinded by entitlement and greed, unable to recognize the love that could have carried him further than money ever will. His life will be marked by the choices he made, and though I will never give him the wealth he demanded, I hope the memory of his humiliation serves as a lesson he cannot ignore. As for me, my days are no longer filled with the loneliness that once consumed me. I walk outside, I breathe freely, I speak with people who value my presence, and I carry myself with the quiet dignity of a man who has faced betrayal and turned it into strength. My final word to those who hear my story is this: do not let betrayal define you. Do not let abandonment steal your worth. And do not let the cruelty of others convince you that your life has no meaning. Even when it feels like everything has been taken, there is always the possibility of a twist of fate, always the possibility of rediscovering yourself, always the chance to rise. My own son left me at a nursing home on my birthday, a moment that could have been the end of me. But a week later I won the lottery, and in that moment I learned that life is never finished until the last breath is drawn. So I leave this story not in anger but in gratitude, for I have been given the gift of a second chance, and with it I have found peace, purpose, and a final word worth speaking. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.